April 17, 1945. Riesa Airfield, 62 kilometers east of Leipzig, Germany. 1100 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Elwyn Righetti pushed his P-51 Mustang into a steep dive from 3,000 feet, the Packard Merlin engine screaming as the altimeter unwound. Through the gun sight he could see what no American pilot was supposed to see this late in the war. Rows of German fighters parked on hardstand, intact and fueled, waiting for pilots who would never fly them. Regetti had been explicitly ordered to remain at altitude. Army Air Force's doctrine in April of 1945 was unambiguous. Fighter groups escorting heavy bombers to targets deep in Germany were to protect the bombers, hand off escort duties to relief squadrons, then return directly to base. Strafing enemy airfields had been declared too dangerous. The losses were unacceptable. 8th Air Force Commander General James Doolittle had watched too many experienced pilots die in the flak-filled air above German air bases. The directive from headquarters at High Wycombe was clear: avoid low-level attack missions. Fighter pilots were too valuable, too difficult to replace. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But Elwyn Righetti, commanding officer of the 55th Fighter Group, had never been good at following orders he disagreed with. At 29 years old, he had already established himself as the most aggressive pilot in the 8th Air Force. His wingman, Lieutenant Carroll Henry, watched from above as Regetti levelled off just above the treetops. The anti-aircraft batteries around Riesa opened fire immediately. Black puffs of flak burst around the silver P-51. Henry heard Regetti's voice crackle over the radio. Permission granted for Henry to follow him down. Henry descended. They were committed now. What happened in the next 7 minutes would justify every objection the High Command had raised about low-level strafing. Regetti would destroy 8 German aircraft on the ground. He would prove that even in the final weeks of the war, when Allied victory seemed inevitable, individual acts of tactical disobedience could still exact a devastating toll on the enemy. And he would vanish, swallowed by the chaos of a collapsing Reich, his fate unknown for nearly 80 years. By mid-April of 1945, the strategic bombing campaign had achieved its objectives. The Luftwaffe was finished. German synthetic fuel production had been destroyed. Transportation networks were paralyzed. The Red Army was closing on Berlin from the east. American and British forces were advancing from the west. The war would be over in 3 weeks. There was no tactical necessity for a fighter group commander to risk his life strafing a secondary airfield in Saxony. But Regetti had transformed the 55th Fighter Group from an unremarkable unit into what his men called the Premier Ground Attack Group in the European theatre. Under his command, the group had destroyed 157 locomotives in January alone. They had demolished more German aircraft on the ground than any other 8th Air Force fighter group. General Henry Arnold, commanding general of the Army Air Forces, had mentioned Regetti by name in press releases. General Doolittle himself had remarked at a command conference, "Regetti, I have heard of you." To understand why Regetti's attack on Riesa violated explicit orders, one must understand the evolution of American fighter tactics in the European Air War. When the 8th Air Force began operations from England in 1942, the mission was straightforward: escort heavy bombers to targets in occupied Europe and Germany, protect them from Luftwaffe interceptors, bring them home safely. Fighter pilots flew defensive missions. Their purpose was to prevent German fighters from reaching the bomber formations. By 1944, that doctrine had changed fundamentally. Major General James Doolittle, who assumed command of the 8th Air Force in January of that year, issued new guidance. American fighters would no longer remain tethered to bomber formations. Instead, they would fly ahead of the bombers, clearing the skies of German fighters before the bombers arrived. When escort duties were complete, fighters would descend to strafe German airfields, destroy aircraft on the ground, attack transportation infrastructure. This offensive doctrine proved devastatingly effective. Between January and May of 1944, the Luftwaffe lost over 2,000 fighters and nearly as many pilots. The campaign destroyed German air superiority. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, Allied aircraft controlled the skies over France. German fighters rarely challenged the bomber streams. The strategic air campaign had achieved its central objective, but low-level strafing exacted a terrible price. German airfields were defended by concentrated anti-aircraft artillery. The 88mm flak gun, originally designed as an anti-tank weapon, had been adapted into the most lethal anti-aircraft weapon in the German arsenal. Lighter 20mm and 37mm automatic cannons surrounded every Luftwaffe installation. Ground fire claimed experienced pilots at rates that appalled 8th Air Force leadership. The mathematics were brutal. A fighter pilot attacking a defended airfield flew his aircraft through a cone of fire. Approaching at 300 miles per hour, barely 50 feet above ground level, the pilot had perhaps 8 seconds of firing time before pulling up to avoid crashing into buildings, hangars, or terrain. During those 8 seconds, every gun crew on the airfield was tracking his aircraft. Tracer rounds laced the air. Shells burst in patterns designed to catch low-flying aircraft. The pilot had no room to maneuver. He was committed to his attack run from the moment he entered German airspace. Fighter losses to ground fire during strafing missions reached crisis levels in late 1944. Eighth Air Force records documented the casualties with grim precision. Between October and December of 1944, more American fighter pilots died strafing German targets than were lost in air-to-air combat. The Luftwaffe could no longer contest Allied air supremacy, but German anti-aircraft defences remained formidable. General Doolittle faced a strategic dilemma. Strafing attacks destroyed German aircraft, locomotives, and transportation infrastructure. They disrupted Wehrmacht logistics. They prevented the Luftwaffe from rebuilding its fighter force, but the cost in pilots was becoming unsustainable. By early 1945, the pool of experienced replacement pilots was diminishing. Training programs in the United States could produce adequate pilots, but could not replicate combat experience. Each veteran pilot lost over a German airfield represented hundreds of hours of irreplaceable combat knowledge. In March of 1945, 8th Air Force Headquarters issued revised guidance. Fighter groups were encouraged to attack targets of opportunity during return flights from escort missions, but group commanders were instructed to exercise caution. Heavily defended airfields were to be avoided. The potential gains did not justify the probable losses. The war was nearly won. Preserving experienced pilots for the anticipated invasion of Japan took priority over tactical strikes against a defeated enemy. Elwyn Righetti ignored these directives. He had arrived in England in October of 1944 as a 29-year-old lieutenant colonel, with thousands of hours of flying experience but no combat time. He had spent the war training pilots in the United States, repeatedly requesting assignment to a combat unit. When he finally reached the 55th Fighter Group at Wormingford, England, he found a demoralized unit with mediocre performance records. The 55th had flown bomber escort missions for over a year without distinguishing itself. Regetti transformed the 55th through the force of his personality and his absolute contempt for cautious tactics. His approach to fighter combat was elemental. Find the enemy, attack the enemy, destroy the enemy, repeat until no targets remained. He flew combat missions with an intensity that unsettled even experienced pilots. His logbook from November 1944 through April 1945 documents a pattern of aggressive action that bordered on recklessness. Other group commanders flew their required combat missions, then rotated to staff positions. Regetti flew constantly. He led his squadrons on every challenging mission. When weather grounded other groups, Regetti took his pilots below the clouds to find targets. When bomber escort duties ended early, he refused to return to base with unused ammunition and fuel. He hunted locomotives, strafed convoys, destroyed parked aircraft. His kill tally grew not through aerial victories, which were rare by late 1944, but through systematic destruction of ground targets. The 55th Fighter Group's transformation under Rigetti's command was documented in official records. In January of 1945, the group destroyed 157 locomotives, more than any other unit in the 8th Air Force. They claimed more German aircraft destroyed on the ground than any comparable unit. Their ground crews worked through frozen nights to keep aircraft operational. Their pilots flew missions in weather that kept other groups grounded. Rigetti drove them mercilessly, and they responded with ferocious dedication. But this success came at personal cost that Rigetti accepted, and his men struggled to comprehend. He had left behind a wife, Catherine, and a daughter who was 2 years old when he deployed to England. His letters home spoke of missing his family, of longing to return to the ranch in San Luis Obispo, California, where he had been born. Yet his combat flying suggested a man indifferent to survival, focused solely on maximizing damage to the enemy before the war ended. The psychology behind this approach was never fully articulated. Rigetti was not suicidal. He was methodical, calculating, and tactically brilliant. He understood anti-aircraft patterns better than most pilots. He could read terrain, identify safe approach angles, exploit defender blind spots. His survival through dozens of strafing missions testified to genuine skill. But there was something else driving him, something his fellow pilots recognized but could not name. Perhaps it was the frustration of spending years training others while the war was being fought without him. Perhaps it was the knowledge that he had arrived late to the combat theatre and had limited time to prove himself. Perhaps it was simply his nature. By April of 1945, Rigetti had been promoted to full colonel and given command of the 55th Fighter Group. He was now responsible for approximately 2,000 personnel, including pilots, ground crews, intelligence officers, mechanics, and support staff. The administrative burden should have kept him grounded more frequently. Group commanders typically flew fewer combat missions as their command responsibilities increased. Rigetti flew more. His final mission profile was typical. The 55th would escort B-17 heavy bombers to targets near Dresden. After handoff to relief fighters, the group would return to Wormingford. The mission order was explicit. Escort duties only. No ground attack. High Command had identified increased anti-aircraft activity in the Dresden area. Intelligence reports suggested the Germans were concentrating remaining flak batteries around strategic installations. The risk-reward calculation did not favor offensive action. Rigetti briefed his pilots on the mission parameters, acknowledged the restrictions, then prepared his personal aircraft. His P-51 Mustang, named Katydid after his wife, was maintained to exacting standards by his dedicated crew chief. The aircraft's 650 caliber Browning machine guns had been test-fired that morning. Ammunition load was standard, 1,800 rounds total, 300 per gun. Fuel tanks were topped off. The aircraft was ready for combat. It was his 30th birthday. In 3 weeks, the war in Europe would end. But on the morning of April 17, 1945, Elwyn Righetti climbed into his cockpit, started his engine, and took off on the mission that would make him vanish from history. The P-51 Mustang that Elwyn Righetti flew on April 17, 1945, was serial number 44-72227. The second Katydid he had flown, his original aircraft, 44-14223, had been replaced with this newer P-51D-20 model in early April. The specifications of this machine were the culmination of 4 years of continuous refinement in American fighter design. The Packard V16507 engine, a license-built version of the Rolls-Royce Merlin 66, generated 1,490 horsepower at takeoff. The 2-speed, 2-stage supercharged engine gave the Mustang exceptional performance at all altitudes. Maximum speed at level flight exceeded 438 miles per hour. Combat radius, with internal fuel only, was 500 miles. With 2 external drop tanks, operational range extended to 1,375 miles. The aircraft could reach an operational ceiling of 42,000 feet. But for low-level strafing missions, these altitude capabilities were irrelevant. What mattered was the armament. 6 Browning M2 50 caliber machine guns, 3 mounted in each wing. The inboard guns on each wing carried 400 rounds per gun. The center and outboard guns carried 270 rounds each. Total ammunition capacity, 1,840 rounds. Rate of fire for each gun, approximately 800 rounds per minute. When all 6 guns fired simultaneously, the combined rate of fire approached 4,800 rounds per minute. The recoil from this firepower was substantial enough to slow the aircraft noticeably during firing runs. Pilots learned to compensate for this deceleration. The guns were bore-sighted for convergence at a distance between 250 and 300 yards, creating a cone of fire that maximized hit probability against point targets. Each 50 caliber round measured half an inch in diameter and 3.91 inches in length. Standard ammunition load mixed armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds. Armor-piercing rounds featured hardened steel cores designed to penetrate engine blocks and armored components. Incendiary rounds contained combustible materials that ignited on impact, starting fires in fuel tanks and hydraulic systems. Tracer rounds left visible trails, allowing pilots to adjust their aim during combat. The ballistic performance of the 50 caliber M2 Browning was well documented. Muzzle velocity exceeded 2,900 feet per second. Maximum effective range against aerial targets was approximately 1,200 yards, though most air combat occurred at ranges below 400 yards. Against ground targets, the ammunition remained lethal at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. A typical strafing run lasted between 6 and 10 seconds from initial trigger pull to disengagement. During a 10-second burst with all 6 guns firing, a P-51 would expend approximately 800 rounds, leaving slightly more than 1,000 rounds remaining. Experienced pilots fired in shorter bursts, conserving ammunition for multiple targets. Regetti, with months of combat experience, understood ammunition management precisely. The tactical challenge of strafing a defended airfield required balancing multiple competing factors. Approach altitude had to be low enough to avoid radar detection, but high enough to allow the pilot to identify targets. Attack angle needed to be shallow enough for accurate fire, but steep enough to minimize exposure time to anti-aircraft defenses. Airspeed had to be fast enough to reduce vulnerability, but slow enough to allow target acquisition and accurate shooting. Standard 8th Air Force procedure for strafing attacks specified an approach at 500 feet altitude, accelerating to maximum speed during the final approach, descending to 50 feet or less during the firing run, then pulling up sharply and exiting at full power. The entire attack from initial dive to final exit typically lasted less than 90 seconds per aircraft. During those 90 seconds, the pilot was exposed to every defensive weapon on the airfield. German airfield defenses in April of 1945 varied depending on the installation's importance. Major Luftwaffe bases featured extensive anti-aircraft batteries. The 88mm flak gun could fire 15 to 20 rounds per minute with an effective ceiling of 26,000 feet. Against low-flying aircraft, the 88 was less effective due to its slow traverse rate, but a direct hit would destroy any fighter instantly. More dangerous to strafing aircraft were the lighter automatic weapons. The 37mm flak 36 could fire 80 rounds per minute and track low-flying aircraft effectively. The 20mm flak-filled 38, a quad-mounted automatic cannon, could fire 1,800 rounds per minute and was specifically designed for low-altitude defense. A single well-aimed burst from a flak-filled could tear apart a P-51's wing or engine cowling. Ground crews operating these weapons had months or years of experience. By April of 1945, German anti-aircraft units had defended against thousands of Allied strafing attacks. They understood attack patterns. They knew the approach angles American pilots favored. They had learned to track fast-moving targets and lead their fire appropriately. The tactical doctrine that Rigetti was violating had been written based on these realities. 8th Air Force Headquarters had compiled loss statistics throughout 1944 and early 1945. The data was unambiguous. Strafing attacks against defended airfields resulted in higher pilot losses per mission than any other type of fighter operation, including escort missions penetrating to Berlin. Between October of 1944 and March of 1945, the 8th Air Force had lost more than 150 fighters to ground fire during strafing missions. Each lost aircraft represented not just material cost, but the loss of an experienced pilot. Training a replacement pilot to basic proficiency required approximately 200 hours of flight time. Developing the combat judgment that separated survival from death required months of operational experience that could not be replicated in training. The institutional logic for restricting strafing operations was therefore sound. The war was nearly won. German aircraft production had collapsed. Luftwaffe fighter units were grounded due to fuel shortages. Strategic bombing had achieved its objectives. There was no tactical necessity to risk experienced pilots on ground attack missions when the enemy was weeks from collapse. But this institutional logic failed to account for the psychology of men like Elwyn Righetti. He had not spent years training others only to miss combat himself. He had not transformed the 55th Fighter Group into an elite unit to watch them sit idle during the war's final weeks. He had not built a reputation as the most aggressive fighter commander in the 8th Air Force to follow cautious directives from headquarters officers who flew desks instead of fighters. Regetti understood the risks perfectly. He had studied the loss statistics. He had attended briefings on German anti-aircraft capabilities. He had lost men from his own group to ground fire. He knew that every strafing run represented a calculated gamble with death, and he chose to take that gamble anyway, repeatedly, until it killed him. The mission briefing at Wormingford on the morning of April 17th had been routine. The 55th Fighter Group would escort B-17 bombers attacking targets near Dresden. After bomber handoff to relief fighters, the P-51 seconds would return directly to base. Weather forecast indicated 5/10 cloud cover at 5,000 feet. No ground attack operations were authorized. Squadron commanders were specifically instructed to avoid unnecessary risks. Rigetti attended the briefing, acknowledged the restrictions, said nothing to indicate disagreement. He taxied katydid to the runway at 09:20 hours, took off with his 3 squadrons behind him, climbed to altitude, and flew the prescribed route toward the rendezvous point with the bomber stream. Everything proceeded according to plan until the moment when it did not. The bomber escort mission proceeded without incident. German fighters did not challenge the formation. Luftwaffe interceptor forces had been effectively destroyed during the sustained air campaigns of 1944. By April of 1945, German fighter pilots rarely attacked bomber formations that included fighter escort. The tactical situation had inverted completely from the desperate battles of 1943, when American bombers had suffered devastating losses. After handoff to the relief fighter group, Regetti should have led his squadrons back to England. Instead, he descended below the clouds. His radio call sign was Windsor. He ordered most of his aircraft to remain at altitude in a wide orbit. Then he called Lieutenant Carroll Henry and told him they were going to look for targets of opportunity. They found the airfield near Kamenz first. Regetti led attacks that destroyed several aircraft on the ground. When nothing remained there worth attacking, he turned west. Over Riesa, approximately 42 kilometers northwest of Dresden, they spotted another Luftwaffe installation. The Risa Airfield was a secondary facility, not one of the major Luftwaffe bases that would have been heavily defended. But it was still operational, and German aircraft were visible on the hardstands. Regetti ordered the rest of his flight to maintain altitude while he descended to assess the defenses. Henry requested permission to follow him down. Regetti authorized it. They descended through patchy clouds, leveling off at approximately 500 feet. Regetti led them across the northern edge of the airfield, flying west to east, examining the layout. He spotted aircraft parked at various locations around the perimeter. Then he saw something else, a Focke-Wulf 190 on final approach to land, wheels down, flaps extended, completely vulnerable. Regetti ordered Henry to take the FW-190. Henry dove toward the German fighter. The pilot of the FW-190 apparently never saw the American P-51 until Henry's guns opened fire. Henry's 650 caliber machine guns raked the slow-moving German aircraft. The FW-190 crashed onto the runway in flames. Henry watched it roll over and burn. Meanwhile, Rigetti made his first strafing run across the airfield. He spotted a Messerschmitt 109 parked near the edge of the field. Banking slightly left, he aligned his gun sight on the target, held position as the range decreased, then pressed the trigger. The 6 guns in Katydid's wings hammered out 800 rounds per minute, 1,800 total bullets filling the air during a 3-second burst. Armor-piercing, incendiary rounds slashed through the parked Messerschmitt. The aircraft exploded in flames. Rigetti wrenched Katydid into a sharp turn, staying low, looking for his next target. Anti-aircraft fire began bursting around him. The German gun crews had been caught unprepared initially, but they were reacting now. Black puffs of exploding shells filled the air, tracer rounds streaked past his canopy. He lined up on another aircraft and fired again, another target destroyed. He pulled up slightly, turned hard, descended again, searching for more aircraft to attack. The anti-aircraft fire was intensifying. Every gun position around the airfield was now tracking him. He was making repeated passes over the same heavily defended target, exactly the tactical mistake that training emphasized pilots should never make. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But Regetti continued attacking. He identified a third aircraft and made another strafing run. His guns hammered the target. It erupted in flames. He turned again, found another aircraft, destroyed it. Then another. The German gunners were fully alert now, concentrating their fire on the single P-51 making pass after pass across their airfield. Carol Henry, watching from altitude, later described what he witnessed. Rigetti made multiple firing runs, methodically destroying aircraft after aircraft. Anti-aircraft fire surrounded him continuously. The black bursts of exploding shells formed a pattern in the sky, tracking his movements. Henry saw tracer rounds converging on Rigetti's aircraft. He could not understand how Rigetti was surviving. Rigetti started his third complete strafing run. He spotted another German fighter and lined up for the attack. His ammunition was running low after the sustained firing, but he had enough for one more pass. He squeezed the trigger. The 650 caliber guns raked the target aircraft. It exploded. In that same moment, Rigetti heard a loud metallic bang. Katydid shuddered. A burst of anti-aircraft fire had struck the aircraft's cooling system. Coolant began streaming from the radiator beneath the fuselage. Henry, watching from above, saw the white stream of coolant vapor trailing behind Rigetti's P-51. Rigetti's voice came over the radio. He had been hit. His coolant was leaking. The Packard Merlin engine depended on liquid cooling. Without coolant, the engine would overheat catastrophically within minutes. Loss of coolant meant loss of the aircraft. Rigetti had two choices: bail out immediately over the airfield, or try to gain distance before crash landing. What happened next defied all rational calculation. Instead of immediately exiting the area, Rigetti called over the radio that he had enough ammunition for one more pass. He turned Katydid back toward the airfield and made a final strafing run. With his engine already damaged, coolant streaming from his aircraft, certain knowledge that his plane was doomed, he attacked one more target. His guns fired. Another German aircraft was destroyed. Then Rigetti turned west, heading 270 degrees, trying to gain distance from the airfield before his engine failed completely. He climbed slightly, trying to maximize his glide distance when the engine quit. Henry tried to stay with him but had too much speed from his descent. He overshot Rigetti's damaged aircraft. Henry pulled power, tried to slow down, rolled out heading west. He looked back to locate Rigetti. The damaged P-51 was gone. Henry searched the sky. Nothing. He descended, trying to spot the crash site. He made one complete orbit of the area. He could not locate Rigetti's aircraft on the ground. About 30 seconds after losing visual contact, Henry heard Rigetti's voice on the radio one final time. The exact words of Rigetti's last radio transmission were recorded in Lieutenant Carroll Henry's after-action witness statement. The official document, filed as part of Missing Air Crew Report 13916, preserved what may have been the last words Elwyn Righetti ever spoke. "I broke my nose, but I am okay. I got 9 today. Tell my family I am okay, and it has been swell working with you." The transmission lasted approximately 10 seconds, then silence. Henry continued orbiting the area, searching for visual confirmation of Rigetti's location. He could not see the downed aircraft. German territory, hostile forces everywhere, no other American aircraft in the vicinity. Henry was alone, low on fuel, deep inside enemy airspace. He had no choice but to depart. Henry headed west toward Allied lines. Behind him, Elwyn Righetti was somewhere on the ground, alive according to his own words, but surrounded by a German population that had endured 5 years of Allied bombing and strafing attacks. The war was 3 weeks from ending. Berlin was encircled by Soviet forces. Allied armies were advancing from the west. The Nazi regime was collapsing, but April of 1945 was also a period of breakdown in German civil authority, particularly in areas overrun by Allied forces. The historical record documents numerous cases of Allied airmen being murdered by German civilians in the final months of the war. Official Wehrmacht policy required captured airmen to be turned over to military authorities for processing as prisoners of war. But that policy was inconsistently enforced as central authority collapsed. Local Nazi Party officials sometimes encouraged violence against captured airmen. Civilians whose homes had been destroyed by Allied bombing sometimes took revenge on any airman they could capture. Righetti had successfully crash-landed his aircraft. His radio transmission confirmed he was conscious and mobile. He believed he had destroyed 9 aircraft that day. The official Luftwaffe records, compiled after the war, documented that the Riesa Airfield strafing attack on April 17, 1945, resulted in the destruction of 3 Messerschmitt 109s, 1 Focke-Wulf 190, and 7 unidentified aircraft, plus 1 Fieseler Storch observation aircraft damaged. The total matched Righetti's claim, but Righetti never returned. Search efforts after the war found no trace of him. No prisoner of war records listed his name. No grave was ever located. No witness came forward to describe his capture or death. The Soviet occupation of the area where he disappeared complicated post-war investigations. East German authorities were uncooperative with American inquiries about missing personnel. Rigetti's wife, Catherine, received official notification that her husband was missing in action. 1 year later, on April 18, 1946, he was declared dead. His daughter was 3 years old. The Distinguished Service Cross was awarded posthumously. He was promoted posthumously to full colonel. His name was inscribed on the tablets of the missing at Henri-Chapelle American Cemetery in Belgium. The 55th Fighter Group's mission summary report for April 17, 1945, included a statement about their commander's loss. The language was formal military prose, but the emotional content was evident. "We're going to miss you, Colonel, all 29 years of your bursting energy and vitality, your eagerness and courage, your initiative and leadership that molded us into what we are today." For the Regetti family at the ranch near San Luis Obispo, California, Elwyn's disappearance created a different kind of loss. His parents, Guido and Elizabeth, never accepted that he was dead. They kept a light burning for him continuously, maintaining hope that somehow he had survived and would return. His siblings did the same. As each family member died over the following decades, they maintained that light, refusing to extinguish the possibility that Elwyn might still come home. The most probable explanation for Rigetti's disappearance, based on circumstantial evidence and patterns documented in similar cases, is that he was captured by German civilians shortly after crash landing and was murdered before Wehrmacht authorities could intervene. The breakdown of civil order in Germany during April of 1945 made such incidents disturbingly common. The specific circumstances of his death remain unknown, but the central irony of Rigetti's final mission is undeniable. He was killed or captured while executing an attack that violated explicit orders during a war that was already won, 3 weeks before Germany's surrender. The strategic value of destroying 8 German aircraft at Riesa Airfield on April 17, 1945, was effectively zero. Those aircraft would never fly combat missions. Their pilots had no fuel. The Luftwaffe was finished. The Third Reich was collapsing. Rigetti had achieved nothing of military significance that day, except to confirm that even the most skilled, experienced, aggressive fighter pilot could not survive indefinitely against concentrated anti-aircraft fire. The institutional caution that 8th Air Force Headquarters had tried to impose through their restrictions on strafing missions was vindicated by Regetti's loss. The orders he violated had been designed specifically to prevent exactly what happened to him, yet Rigetti had made a choice. He chose to attack because attacking was what he had trained to do, what he believed his duty required, what his personality demanded. He had transformed himself from a flight instructor into the most effective strafing pilot in the 8th Air Force through aggressive tactics that disregarded personal safety. On his 30th birthday, he flew one final mission consistent with everything he had demonstrated over the previous 6 months. The collision between Rigetti's belief in aggressive action and the material reality of German anti-aircraft defenses was not a surprise. He had survived similar attacks dozens of times, but probability mathematics are unforgiving. Each strafing run represented an independent trial, with a small but non-zero chance of being hit by ground fire. Over enough trials, the improbable becomes inevitable. The evidence that destroyed Rigetti's chance of survival was simple: a burst of anti-aircraft fire that ruptured his aircraft's cooling system. That single burst, probably lasting less than 2 seconds, from one gun crew among dozens around the airfield, determined the outcome. Not superior German tactics, not inadequate American technology, not insufficient training, just the statistical certainty that repeated exposure to danger eventually results in being hit. Rigetti's final words suggested he understood this. "It has been swell working with you." Not a statement of regret, not an expression of fear, just an acknowledgement that his time was finished. He had done the work he came to do. Whether that work justified the cost is a question that cannot be answered objectively, only understood in the context of who Elwyn Righetti was and what he chose to be. 5 days after Elwyn Righetti disappeared, Colonel Ben Rimmerman assumed command of the 55th Fighter Group. Rimmerman had been executive officer under Righetti and understood the culture his predecessor had created. He faced the difficult task of maintaining operational effectiveness while the group processed the loss of their commander. The transition occurred during the final weeks of the war, when every mission could be the last, when survival seemed tantalizingly close but remained uncertain. The 55th Fighter Group flew its final combat mission on April 21, 1945, 4 days after Righetti disappeared. 17 days before Germany's unconditional surrender on May 8, the missions flown during those final days targeted remaining Wehrmacht transportation networks and fuel depots. German resistance was collapsing, but isolated units continued fighting. The tactical situation remained dangerous for Allied aircrews, even as strategic victory became inevitable. The statistics documented what Righetti had accomplished during his brief command. Between February 22 and April 17, 1945, the 55th Fighter Group had destroyed more ground targets than any comparable period in the unit's history. The January locomotive destruction record of 157 remained unmatched by any other 8th Air Force Fighter Group. The unit had been awarded 2 distinguished unit citations during the war. The first, for missions between September 3 and 13, 1944, recognized the destruction of 106 enemy aircraft through combined air-to-air combat and ground strafing. The second, awarded for operations on February 19, 1945, recognized ground attack effectiveness against German transportation infrastructure. Catherine eventually remarried and built a new life, but she never forgot her first husband. The daughter, who had been 3 years old when her father disappeared, grew up with stories about a man she could barely remember. Family photographs showed a man in uniform, always smiling, radiating confidence. Letters preserved in family archives documented his training, his deployment to England, his combat experiences. But the man himself was absent, transformed into memory and narrative. The Korean War, Vietnam War, and subsequent conflicts each produced new generations of pilots facing similar decisions. How much risk was justified for marginal tactical gain? When should ground attack missions be aborted due to defenses? How many passes should be made against a single target? These questions had no universal answers. Context varied. But Rigetti's final mission remained in the background of these discussions. An example of what happens when aggression overcomes prudence. The broader lesson extends beyond military aviation into organizational leadership generally. Rigetti transformed the 55th Fighter Group through personality and example. He demanded excellence, demonstrated courage, and inspired loyalty. But his leadership style was also ultimately unsustainable. He drove himself at a pace that could not be maintained indefinitely. His death was not a random accident, but a statistically predictable outcome of repeated high-risk behavior. Organizations often celebrate transformational leaders who produce dramatic improvements in performance. But those same organizations must recognize that leadership styles built on extreme personal example can create unsustainable expectations. If the leader's effectiveness depends on actions that other members cannot or should not replicate, then the organization becomes dependent on a unique individual whose loss creates crisis. The light burning at the Rigetti ranch for 60 years symbolizes something deeper than one family's grief. It represents the human inability to accept uncertain loss. When soldiers die in combat with witnesses and recovered remains, families receive closure, however painful. When soldiers disappear without trace, families are left with ambiguity that prevents complete mourning. The mind cannot fully process a loss that remains unconfirmed. Modern military organizations have learned from this dynamic. Casualty notification procedures emphasize providing families with maximum information as quickly as possible. Remains recovery efforts continue decades after conflicts end. The Defense POW, MIA accounting agency, established to account for missing military personnel, dedicates substantial resources to investigating historical cases. These efforts recognize that uncertainty causes ongoing trauma that extends across generations. Rigetti's name is inscribed on the tablets of the missing at Henri Chapelle American Cemetery in Belgium, along with more than 700 other American service members who disappeared in the European theatre during World War II. These tablets represent the war's unresolved casualties, the men who left for combat and never returned, whose fates remain unknown. Each name represents not just an individual loss, but a family's perpetual uncertainty. The question that began this narrative returns with fuller context. Was Rigetti's final attack justified? From pure tactical analysis, no. Destroying 8 German aircraft on April 17, 1945, had no measurable impact on the war's outcome. Germany surrendered 3 weeks later. Those aircraft would never have flown combat missions. The strategic value was zero. But from the perspective of Rigetti's character and values, the question becomes more complex. He believed that a fighter pilot's duty was to find and destroy enemy capability whenever possible. He had built the 55th Fighter Group around that principle. To decline an opportunity to attack German aircraft because headquarters deemed it too risky would have violated everything he stood for. His final mission was consistent with his beliefs, even if those beliefs ultimately killed him. The collision between individual warrior ethos and institutional risk management that destroyed Rigetti remains unresolved in modern military culture. Organizations continue seeking fighters with his aggression and dedication while also trying to prevent the losses that such aggression produces. The balance shifts across time and context, but the fundamental tension persists. Elwyn Righetti, born April 17, 1915, disappeared April 17, 1945, exactly 30 years later. His daughter barely remembered him, his wife remarried. His parents died hoping for his return. His siblings maintained a light burning for decades. The 55th Fighter Group continued operations without him, then was inactivated and dissolved. The war ended. The world moved forward. But the story endures because it captures something essential about human nature under extreme conditions. The drive to prove oneself, the refusal to accept limitations, the willingness to risk everything for abstract concepts like duty and honor. These impulses create both heroism and tragedy, often simultaneously, often in the same person, often in 5 minutes over an airfield that no longer exists, attacking aircraft that would never fly, pursuing a victory that was already won. That is the cost of truth. That is the price of the warrior's path. That is what happened when one pilot's forbidden buzz saw attack destroyed aircraft on the ground, and destroyed himself in the process, leaving only questions, memories, and a light burning through 6 decades of darkness, waiting for someone who would never come home. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.